to Amazon. Procurement women are back. And I feel like this topic is going to be extra spicy. Not that we haven't covered spicy and controversial topics, but there's something that we're going to talk about today that I feel like has just been super heated. And we're hearing more and more, I feel like, mixed conversations about this publicly and personally as well. So we're going to talk about why ESG is nonsense. I'll just
Sorry.
pause there at our we'll probably title the show that, but that was our internal communication. We have a document that we work on and we titled it Why ESG is Nonsense. So I felt that was a good way to kick it off.
And just we have to put the disclaimer out there. I feel like every time I do this, we do an episode, I put a disclaimer. But I'm just going to say, if you think this is political, go back to the Johnny Cash song that we talked about on the DEI episode. The one on the right is on the left. So play that song before you continue, and because this is not meant to be political, this is really to talk about how its applicability to business.
Yeah. So I think let's start with talking a little bit about what ESG is. Not all of our listeners may be super familiar with the acronym. So I describe it, and I mean this is just kind of the common description of it, is environmental, social, and governance. And I think that it's important to call out that I've seen in the last, I would say, probably 12 months or so, I feel like people are actually rebranding it as sustainability. But ESG at its core means environmental, social, and governance. Dr. Eloise, let's talk about why this has become such a big topic in procurement and in other industries, but in procurement in particular, I feel like it really kind of infiltrated our industry in the past few years.
Sure. And by the way, ESG it evolved out of CSR, which is corporate social responsibility, which was just a broad umbrella term. And I don't remember exactly why. It was somewhere around 2020, 2021 that it kind of made this migration. Because in my first book, I was writing about CSR, and then the draft went for editing, and then we changed it to ESG. So I have that indelibly etched in my brain. And I
So
don't know,
someone out there came out with the fancy acronym, I guess, thought
I
ESG
guess
sounded
so.
better.
And I do agree with you. It's become this shorthand for sustainability, but the social part is what we talked about with DEI, and it has to do with also has to do with companies and their responsibility to the populations that they serve or they don't serve or that they potentially exploit. So it is broad, which is also one of its problems. But anyway, the question was, I already forgot. I got off track. Like
So
just
I think let's kind of start educating our audience a little bit before we both talk about our perspectives. But it became a really important hot topic in procurement over the last few years. Like when I started in the industry in marketing procurement, it wasn't even a part of any conversation.
yeah.
Then it became a very important conversation, like just like AI is in everyone's messaging. I feel like ESG was like the thing that you needed to say in all of your messaging and have it on your website. Sales teams needed to talk about it. So why did that happen?
Uh, I think they're just I think we hit an inflection point sort of on the social aspect. You can certainly go back to the George Floyd protest
Mhm.
and the Black Lives Matter movement that coalesced around that, certainly from a social responsibility point of view. And I also think that we've seen a lot more legislation around sustainability coming out of Europe and other areas. I would also hazard a guess that, and this is just a guess here, but during the previous administration, during the Trump administration here in the US, since there were a lot of steps back on anything that was regulatory relating to the environment, I think there was an impetus for businesses to step up. I also would add and fill that void. I would also add that another generational change, if you're a younger millennial, if you're Gen Z, you're coming up and you're realizing that this environmental catastrophe, however you define it, is going to land on their feet. And so, as they have matured and come into the consumer market or into the market as consumers, as they've entered the workforce, I think you're getting it all coalescing at one time, and that's why I think it's become more prominent. Now, the reason for procurement is with all of that, if you're a company and you want to make, or at least be able to report on how you're doing on these areas, well, typically we haven't had good visibility into what our suppliers are doing. And once we started looking at it, we found that most companies are made up of suppliers. The biggest spend is with suppliers. The biggest risk is with suppliers, the biggest ESG opportunities with suppliers. And all of a sudden, that was the one thing we didn't have visibility to. So it became the scramble over the last 3 or 4 years to fill that gap. And that's what I think we've seen happening. And the solution provider market has exploded. As you said, everybody who had a previous solution has branded it with ESG. And so that's where we find ourselves today.
So to add some color to your generational comment. So I'm a huge believer that different generations entering the workforce has a big impact on the trends and the messaging and what the priorities are in a specific industry. So my boyfriend Paul has two girls. One just graduated from Chico State and one is starting her junior year. And they are really big into thrifting. So this
Mm-hmm.
is a thing right now. So I was talking to Elise, who's his youngest daughter. She's the junior, leaving actually for Italy on Monday. She's going to study abroad for a semester. And I asked her, I said, why are you going to thrift stores and buying all these brands that way? And she said, Sarah, my demographic, my part of the population, we're going to have to deal with a crisis here. And so she goes, people my age care about this and we're trying to
Mm-hmm.
do something about it. And she said, so for me, she said, something I can do. She doesn't work, doesn't have a job. She doesn't have a ton of influence right now in the economy, but she said, I can buy things that are reused.
Yep.
That's something that I can do. For me personally, an example of that, Lululemon, lots of controversy around the CEO and some of the politics, which I don't want to get into, but I have worn their clothes for a long time. And they have a new program. It's a repurpose program. So you can sell your Lululemon clothing back to their corporate office. They will clean it, fix it up, and then they resell it. So I now, if I want to buy workout clothes from Lululemon, I will actually do it online through their website. I will actually buy reused, repurposed workout clothes.
Yeah.
Now, part of that is cost driven, right? Lulu's a fortune. You pay $150 for a sock or $200 for a pair of pants, which I don't love. And this repurpose program, the prices are a lot cheaper, but you hope that there's making some impact on the environment as well through this program. So my point of saying this is I have seen firsthand in my life this newer generation that's going to be coming up into the workforce, specifically caring about the E in the ESG,
Yeah.
the
And,
environmental piece.
yeah, and I would add social media into this is, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about this later, but like the power of social media to influence, and I think going back to the George Floyd protest and the Black Lives Matter, that happened again happened at a time when we were all locked down, just staring at our computers all day. But also, social media had the virality that brought that to the forefront, and I think across the board, we're seeing more and more of that. And I'm going to go back to something you did for a long time. You had the Packaging Hall of Fame,
Yep.
and I will never forget. And it was like you were basically publicly shaming people that were packaging with excess packaging. And I'll never forget the one example is it was like 1,000 Jelly Bellies all came individually wrapped in plastic. I mean, I think about that example all the time, and it's because you posted it and
Yeah.
as a commentary, and it stuck with me. And
Yeah.
every time I see something in plastic, I think back to that image, and I think it's really powerful when people do what you did.
Yeah, there so for those who haven't followed me historically, I used to be in the marketing procurement space, and a lot of what our software did was help organizations source and procure packaging. And so I launched a program where once a week I posted an outrageous packaging post that I curated from my audience. So I actually I asked people to submit videos, stories, and photos of the most outrageous packaging they've ever received. I had insane amount of entries, like people from all over the world submitting. And one of the other ones that I just sticks out in my mind is somebody, this was in Europe, I don't remember which country, ordered a hair dryer. They were on vacation. It arrived in, no joke, the size of a box that would have fit a refrigerator. And so it was a female, she gets home from being on vacation and she thought that somebody had accidentally delivered an appliance, right? So expecting that she needs to get on and contact the company. She finds out her hair dryer was in this box. And so that just blew up, like crazy reach, crazy comments and engagement, all because this lady decided to submit to me and I wrote a post about it.
Yeah, and it gets the conversation moving,
Yeah.
and it's hard, and as like Jason, is it Jason Momoa who plays Aquaman, has this very he's from Hawaii, I think, or I he's at least partnered with Hawaiian Airlines. I forget where he's from, but and his big thing is getting them to convert away from single use plastic, and so now they're using. I think he has a water brand, so it's commercially related, but or he has a sponsorship, but it starts to once you start to see it, and that of course has gone viral, and because he's a big star and he's talking about it, and then you start looking around at all the plastic, single-use plastic used on a plane or in all these other areas. So when we tie it back to procurement, you can see these outside influences coming to say that if you worked for Delta or United or whomever, you could see what Jason Momoa is doing with Hawaiian Airlines and think, huh, we should think about how we're doing that, or whether it's plastic straws or the amount of carbon generated to manufacture X. And so that's where it starts. You start to see this po- popular culture, the as we said, the generations, the consumers starting to change the narrative. And if you worked for Lululemon, you would sort of take what Paul's daughters say is like, huh, I better really see what's going on in these thrift stores.
Yeah. So for me, I feel like when I think about ESG becoming a part of the culture or ecosystem and procurement was really when we had large companies publicly making statements around their ESG goals.
Yep.
That's kind of really what the marker was for me when you had major Fortune 500 companies. Now, the intention behind that is questionable and arguable, right? There's a lot of marketing and PR that can be funneled into things like that. But nonetheless, we had companies making very public statements around percentages and numbers and what they were going to focus on for their procurement and purchasing as it related to who they were buying from, the types of organizations they were partnering with, and then how they were going to benchmark and track. So that to me really was kind of the big anchor. And then we saw that trickling through to smaller organizations.
Right. Now, let's 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 uh let's pull out the nonsense meter because I, as everybody, like I agree with you. There were all these proclamations. First, it was carbon neutral or net neutral, whatever, net zero. That's what it was, net zero by 2050, and then it eked down to 2030. And you'd have, I don't know, oil and gas companies and big polluters saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to be net zero by by 2030," and it is so abundantly clear.
Yeah.
I mean, it was abundantly clear 5 years ago, but certainly in 2024, we're almost at the end of 24. They have no prayer of ever hitting those targets, so they either water them down or push them out. That's why the title of today's episode came from me, because this is where the nonsense starts to come in, and where I'm going to get on my little soapbox here. But certainly that's where, like, what was said in public did not match the capabilities.
And I will add that I think it's really unrealistic for small organizations to also try to have these major overarching benchmarks around ESG and trying to publicly make statements or talk about it internally when you don't resource accordingly. So
Yeah.
you have one or two procurement people, right? They already have a full-time job. So is it realistic that that one or two people or that small team is going to be going out and doing all this extra sourcing and track? It's just not realistic. So I feel like it sets this expectation that, oh, this is a joke.
Right. Exactly. Which, that's the damage, is that if we don't believe it, then it just becomes nonsense. Eh,
And then you have on the supplier side people getting creative around, well, okay, we have clients now that have these goals and metrics. I'm going to tweak our numbers to fit into this box. Or, oh, I'm going to go put the company's name and my wife's name. And
right.
now we're a women-owned business, and so we're gonna come in now and take, 20, 30 more percent market share from this customer because now we check that box.
Right. Exactly. And I mean, it's all the way down to, well, first of all, okay, let's just go back for a second. I would also argue that big companies don't have the resourcing to manage this either. So what do they do? Because if you go to the big companies, which I may or may not do, and talk to them about these topics, you will find very quickly that they don't companies don't even know where we're spending all their money, much less how much of it is sustainable, or with whatever, uh, diverse suppliers and so on and so forth. So, like, getting answers to that, just fundamental answers. And so that's why you've got all this explosion of ESG providers coming in and offering to do that. So we're already flawed on the company side asking for that. And then they go and ask their suppliers, and the questions they ask, like, just because you ask the question doesn't mean the supplier understands it. Even if they give you a best faith attempt, or what you said is they just fudge the numbers or fudge the governance or whatever, and you have no idea what they're doing, because you might have 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 suppliers. You're not staffed to do that. So what are we doing here? Like, this, like, a lot of these proclamations lack any semblance of reality.
So I come from manufacturing. Before joining Umnitsa, I was at a source day and we were selling into mid-market manufacturers. So manufacturing was my world for a while. And one of the things that stood out to me is that manufacturing is one of the industries that has the greatest impact on ESG, just because, in particular, when we look at the E, and there's so much that a manufacturer can do to impact the environment in a negative way. So in my world, the E is really near and dear to my heart, just because I saw and spent so much time working with manufacturers. I will say, in that world, most procurement and supply chain teams in manufacturing are very small. You're talking about, a team of, less than 10 people. They are tactical, they're doing a lot of manual work, probably not as progressive and innovative, and haven't invested in technology as much as some of the other organizations. So I would see these companies having a big impact on the environment. And then you would hear things come out from leadership around, oh, we really want to prioritize, we want to focus on ESG, we want to have a better impact on the environment. And then I look at the team and I'm like, you have 3 people on your procurement team. They're all working 80, 90 hours a week. They're stressed to the max. They're focused on a lot of manual work. There's no way they are setting up strategic programs to focus on the environment. And then you look at margins, very,
Hmm.
very low margin industry. It's just like the restaurant space. I used to do a lot of work in the restaurant space, very, very low margin. When you are not making high margins and business is a grind, are you really going to focus on and prioritize ESG? I would argue no.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'm going to like there's also a disconnect because the manufacturing is a good example. Let's just say hypothetically that you can manufacture a product. Let's use something that comes in a plastic container. Let's say you can, and whatever goes in the plastic container doesn't matter. So this plastic container is now 100% recyclable. Like I can put, like I can write 100% recyclable as the manufacturer or the OEM
Mm.
that's contracted the manufacturer or the contracted whoever's manufacturing it, 100% recyclable. And then I'm going to slap that on the sticker and like call it a day and say we did it. We did the E8. We did the E. We solved the E. But here's my issue, because that product sits in a broader life cycle and ecosystem. Okay, so I, as a consumer, go to the store, I buy whatever that comes in this container, it's 100% recyclable. If I don't actually put that in the recycling bin, and if my city or county doesn't have a way to then recycle that container, that 100% recyclable container is just going to sit in a landfill. So there's all these steps that have nothing to do with the big corporate that actually manufactured said bottle. And so we have to this is the nonsense part of it. It's all part of a connected ecosystem, and no pun intended there. And so when we make these lofty, grandiose statements that said we are X, well, that's great that that container is recyclable, but here in the US, only 30% of households recycle. And even then, that doesn't mean the stuff that gets recycled gets reclaimed off the conveyor belts. So this is the issue that I have, is that we're disconnected from the product is disconnected from the usage and the reclamation.
So, having worked in packaging as long as I did, I think most people are unaware of how behind the times our recycling programs are in the US.
Exactly.
There is no federal program, there's no federal policy. It's very, very localized, to the point that different cities could have different requirements based on where you live in the city. So, a huge problem is I go and I recycle something. Well, first of all, a lot of the packaging is not clearly marked. And so you're not clear as the consumer, is this actually recyclable or not? So that's just a basic, companies need to do a better job of labeling their products.
And by the way, I would just say many a marriage gets into trouble over this exact question. Is that recyclable or not? And
Yeah, and then there's the whole thing, and then you throw food on top of it. There
yeah,
was a pizza in this pizza box. Does that mean, even though the box says it's recyclable, is it recyclable? Then you get to, okay, it's clearly marked and there's a numbering system. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not going to get into, I could do a whole episode. I used to do sessions on teaching people how to read their packaging, how to understand what you can and can't recycle, and how to manage it. We won't get into that today, but there's a whole numbering system, and the numbers mean different things. And typically, the lower the number, the more likely it is that it's going to be recyclable. So if it's, you've got a 1 or a 2 on the bottom, it means it's more likely going to be recyclable. So then let's say we throw it in the recycling. Well, the challenge is your local recycling center may not take the numbers that you've put in your recycling basket. So you drop in a number 4, and that gets to the recycling center, and you're not going to know that as an average consumer. You don't understand what you can and can't recycle. You just see the recycling symbol and assume. Then it gets there, they can't recycle it. They just put it in the landfill.
Right.
So a lot of what we put in recycling and think we're being good Samaritans and focused on the E and doing the right thing for the environment, it never actually gets recycled.
Yeah.
So there's an argument. Now, in my house, we do recycle. We have actually 2 recycling bins that are labeled. So I'm not saying we don't, but there's actually an argument for people who don't recycle, because if you look at how much of what you actually put in the recycling gets recycled, I think you would be shocked.
Yeah. 100%.
So that was kind of a tangent, but I wanted to just throw that in to talk about your point around how there's a whole system that needs to be put in place in order for ESG to actually work and make sense. And a lot of that is broken.
Yeah. And I mean, that's where what in the US we have it has become such a contentious political issue. And without going into that, but yeah, without that federal mandate, and even it doesn't mean if we had a federal mandate that would solve it, but with this different localities, everybody's doing something different, and it's a mishmash of stuff. And then, like, to really tease this out, you then have these questions, these thorny questions that come up, like about Tesla and Elon Musk throwing a fit because he got bounced out of the ESG index or whatever it was on the S&P, because he's created, or not created, but he runs a company that creates quote unquote environmentally friendly cars, but because the emissions are because it's saves on emissions, but also batteries are the batteries that power the cars are very caustic and difficult. And so is a Tesla or any electric car, I should single them out, but is an electric car a more environmentally friendly way to go? That knowing that the batteries took a lot of heavy metals out of the ground to manufacture, and the recycling of that battery is very corrosive versus not putting emissions into the environment. And by the way, I'm the last person that can answer that question, but it begs these questions and these trade-offs.
Yeah. For me, I'll just share a little bit about my perspective. So I think some people that were behind this whole ESG movement, I do believe that there was some good intentions, right? They were hoping that this was going to do good. In particular, for me, the E piece, the environmental, I personally care about that. It's something that's important to me. But I think it becomes problematic in practice in a free market capitalistic. And I think ESG can enable politics to creep in more than that is healthy in a free market capitalistic system. So I think some of the politics that then become embedded in programs that fall within the ESG space are actually to a detriment instead of actually doing good. So I think that's a big piece of it that I have a problem with. I also think the data and metrics around calculating ESG scores is flawed. And I actually wonder how accurate they are. So to me, that's another big problem that I have.
Yeah, I agree. First off, I agree with you about the data, the scores, all of that. That is garbage. So, no offense to anybody out there that's in this space, but we can't even agree on the numbers, much less the data. We all know the data is bogus. So, I'm not having it. Like I have yet to see data and
Well,
analysis on.
and there's a major system in this space that we probably all know. They're the largest funded, and it relies on the supplier to fill out a form.
Right.
I mean, of course, I'm not going to make myself look bad or answer the questions in a negative way. So it's like you're already starting off with flawed data with a self input. And then the systems that are out there that go scrape the internet and pull in the data, I would question, is that data? I mean, that's just public knowledge data, but is that data actually even meaningful? So there's not really data to pull from unless you have people going in and doing major complex audits, and who's going to track and manage and do that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why it's all nonsense. I mean, if I'm polluting a river, am I gonna put that on the form
Yeah.
that you send me? No, of course I'm not. I'm gonna say, "Oh, I had no idea," like
Yeah.
plausible deniability.
Where we have
I
great practices, here's what we do, and we just leave out the fact that we've got stuff flowing into the river.
Right, exactly. I do wanna go back to your point about the free market because 'cause I'm gonna give you a counterpoint here, and I say this maybe just to sort of be a little provocative, not because I believe this, but one of the thing and I say this with the idiosyncrasy or the irony of it, but if you look at what the private equity companies are doing, they are holding steady on the ESG because Blackwater and a couple of the others have been the target of political backlash, and they've held their own. And now we can debate whether those ESG programs are worthy, but they have publicly said that their companies that prioritize ESG perform as better or as well, or if not better, than the ones that don't. And I think I mean, just subsequent to when we did the DEI episode, a number of big companies have started to disband their DEI initiatives. And I think so. I do want to credit at least the folks that have been publicly talking about this in private equity of holding the line on at least having something. Now, we can argue that free market's not the best way to do this, but absent anything from the government or the federal government, I do think there is something to be said there.
Yeah, and I would say that I think ESG has, I mentioned this at the beginning, I think it's kind of becoming not as cool and hip as it was with some of this press coming out around companies canceling these types of programs. So we're seeing rebranding. Again, sustainability is the one that I've seen. Another one that I've seen is renaming, calling it responsible business instead of ESG, right?
Yep.
I think Coca-Cola and some other major companies have kind of been playing around with other ways and things to call this. So I think there's been some issues at large organizations around their ESG programs. They've decided to cancel them or reformat or restructure, and they've actually publicly made this known. And so that's kind of started a trigger of this reframing and adjusting or people changing how they're talking about ESG in general.
Yeah, and I I I I just wonder, like, to what end? Like, if like, I'll just cut to my sort of thesis because I talked about this in my book. I would just be happy if companies were not polluting our waterways and consuming all of our natural resources. By the way, I'm vegan, so I drink a lot of plant milks, so mostly oat milk and soy milk, and there's a big backlash against almond milk because almonds are very difficult to grow. They require a lot of water. there's other issues with it, with almond milk. So, like on one hand, you know, you could say, ah, being vegan's better for the planet, but on the other hand, it's creating all these other issues. So the reason I mention that is that I think and this sort of gets back to you. I think if you could have responsible business, I like that term because as long as we're not polluting the waterways, we're not wasting water, we're not putting immense amounts of carbon into the air, fill in the blank, add a bunch more, then I think we're doing like I'll buy that. Like that's okay. I rather see the focus go into political solutions and regulatory pieces. At least here in the U.S., I think they're doing a better job in Europe.
I'll also throw in, I think the human rights and labor practices is really important to me. And if we could have companies who are doing a lot of production overseas figure out a better way to manage their manufacturing and treat their employees, I think that would be huge.
Yeah, and I think this is. I'm going to bring back the social media aspect of this because I think this is where the consumer focus and by consumer, I mean not only those purchasing the product, but also citizens that live in these countries that are either broadly consuming these products or that are, you know, the subject of being of these forced labor. I think social media has brought this to the forefront in ways that those of us that are older can't quite grasp the fact that somebody can take pictures in the DRC in Congo and then they can go instantly global, or palm oil plantations in Indonesia, or just satellite photos, and you can see satellite photos of rainforest being clear cut 1 year to the next. Like these are staggering images, and they brings these issues much more front and center in ways that historically would have taken months, if not years or decades. And so the feedback loop between damage to awareness to different action really brings that to the forefront. And so you see that with you see that in the DRC. You certainly see that um, with uh, 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 with palm oil, with the effects of uh, uh, climate change on cacao
Makeup
beans,
is another industry with all
makeup.
the glitter, and that's a huge one.
Yeah, and so you start. So when you talk about human rights and labor and forced labor, it's not like it's not in the shadows anymore. You can find it, and so oftentimes with these algorithms, it finds you, and so it's harder to hide these things than it used to be.
And that goes back to consumers being more conscious about the brands that they buy from, right? It's easy to click a button and buy something on Amazon versus spending a little bit of time to do some research to buy from more specific targeted companies.
And I think this is where being able to have the source materials and the whole chain of custody of provenance for how a product is created, where it's created, how it traveled, the carbon footprint to bring it to where I am is so important. And it's also important to understand that buying decision is so easy to change now.
Yeah. So I was at a marketing conference last year, and I can't remember the name of the company, but the head of marketing was there from an organization that has ID tracking tags. And their market, he said, was really starting to explode because of supply chain and organizations caring more about from the actual point of inception through delivery, tracking the status of every stage of something being produced or manufactured. And so I thought that was interesting that he said their usage and increase in demand was heavily driven by supply chain.
Yeah. And I think we'll see more of that and supply chains being, whether conscious or not, a real differentiator in the success of companies. And I would well, I am a big proponent of that.
So, where do you see ESG solutions going? Like, what's going to happen to those firms that have heavily invested and gone all in on that being the problem that they're solving?
Well, I'm on record saying I am not a fan of ESG solutions for all the reasons we've talked about. And I think ESG solutions have like the ROI is not there. I'm not saying that I don't believe in this stuff. I'm not saying I don't think, I mean, I believe in climate change. I believe we're headed for an environmental disaster. But I don't think collecting data and giving me dashboards is going to move the needle. And I don't see companies buying that stuff. So if I'm an investor, I'm not investing in it. I want to see better harmony throughout the product life cycle. I want to see better just attentiveness to this, but I don't think I need to buy a solution to do to report on ESG. In fact, I would argue that the way the sophistication of the tools, we could do it without third-party tools because there's no direct ROI. And I'm going to say this for about the 4 millionth time that value in procurement comes from sourcing. It comes from improved intake slash requisitioning. It comes from contract compliance. It does not come from reporting on ESG. So I don't think anybody will ever convince me that risk and ESG tools create direct hard savings value. They might be worth doing, or they might not be. That's a different debate. So I think we really have to get precise. And so I think that ESG market is going to collapse underneath itself because the tools are not profit generating to the way that they will be expected to.
I have a tracker in my notes to closely follow the ESG brands over the next 12 months and see what happens if we see some major acquisitions happening where larger brands are scooping it up and making the ESG data or dashboard a small part of a much larger offering, or if we're just going to see these companies kind of fall by the wayside.
Yeah, I think they all get acquired or they go away in some way, shape, or form. It's not that we don't need them. It's just, are they features or tools? And I think they're more features versus tools or solutions. I also want to make two broader points. Not now that I've just trashed the entire ESG market, but I think it's important because when we talk about regulations, because we talked about that a couple of times, the EU has passed a lot of good regulations, but just because they get passed over there doesn't mean they get passed over here in the North America. And I think that's a problem because I mean, if you look at the ingredients, as Europeans and UK folks like to point out that our all of our products have way too much sugar in them, which I agree with, and they have way too many chemicals because you'll see the same product. There's a lot of this on social media. The same product that you produce in two different areas, and the in the U.S. we have way more chemicals and sugar and et cetera, et cetera. So the reason I point that out is that just because you have regulations happening in Europe, especially around forced labor and some of these products, that it doesn't mean they translate over here. And I think we are reckoning with that here in North America, or certainly in the United States, I should say. And I think until we do that, then I think we are going to struggle to tackle businesses are going to struggle to contribute meaningfully to the environment.
It reminds me of the what's happening in the marijuana space. The regulations are so dependent on the region
Yep.
that it's very, very hard for suppliers to even get a handle on how to do any sort of distribution or legislation. Because if I am selling an edible or something online and someone orders it in Arizona in a certain city, they might need to have different ingredients or different packaging or different labeling than somebody who placed the order here in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
So it's been kind of a mess with the suppliers trying to figure out how to even manage it. And it kind of relates back to your point. If things are being done differently in different areas, how effective are they actually?
Right. And So that's a really great example because there's 2 points I would make. With a really finely tuned supply chain, the ability to change and adjust ingredients and packaging and labeling actually could be a competitive differentiator if we got to that level of sophistication, which eventually we will. However, the other piece about that is, and this gets back to business responsibility or whatever the new term is banks will not process marijuana based sales, and they have a. It's interesting when you how much influence the banking industry can have on these newer markets, and this comes up several times. So and this is why getting that regulatory piece solved makes a difference because you start to get you might be able to produce the same product everywhere and sell it, but not
Yeah,
using
I'm
credit
not
cards.
gonna walk into my credit union or bank with $200,000 in cash and expect
Right.
to be able to just drop that into an account.
Yeah. And so I think the sort of more broader point I want to make, and I think I would be remiss, those that know me, if I didn't point this out, is let me just say, let's say every business starts acting responsibly, and we give everybody A plus for effort, and then we'll give them an A plus for execution. Let's say everybody is humming along, reducing carbon, doing their own thing. I would also point out that that we also have a number of very significant wars going on right now, or armed conflicts, and some that are in the news every day and some that are not in the news every day. And I think we're if you just look at what's happening, I believe it's the tanker. I might butcher this name, but the Soyunion is the tanker that's on fire in the Red Sea right now. And if it, because the Houthis attacked it and basically blew it up. So if that oil spills, that's going to be 4 times more oil than the Exxon Valdez, and it's going to create an environmental catastrophe just there in the Red Sea. And I think it's important to note that, and the amount of shelling and that's gone on between Russia and Ukraine, and I know that there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the Middle East. So what is the like? I can tell you one thing: a tank does not have is not green, and that the diesel that or the fuel that powers these various implements of war are not green, and they're never going to be green. So we are creating a lot of destruction at the same time, and I think we are turning. I don't know that we are fully when we talk about uh, net zero for a company, that might be true, but we are living again in a global society. And what happens if there's a nuclear accident or a nuclear bomb, heaven forbid, going off in Russia or in Ukraine? Like that doesn't isn't going to be localized there. And so I think as we talk about this more broadly, we have to talk about what's happening in these wars, and that that it you can't just segment them off. It's not compartmentalizable. I don't think that's a word, but I just want to point out that no matter how much work we do in the business world, we that there is a much bigger threat out there, or at least that is uncontrolled by business.
Which means we need to arm ourselves with smart people who can make real-time decisions based on whatever happens, because there's stuff that's going to happen that you can't plan or prepare for.
And we need to get these smart people. Maybe it all comes back to politics, and that we need more of these smart people to go into politics versus the greedy, egotistical, power hungry folks.
Yeah, well, I'll save my rant for living in California for another time.
That will be a fun one. We should add that to the list.
All right, are we anything else you want to throw in for ESG?
No, I just want to say that it is important. I personally believe that it is important that we take this seriously. Climate change is real. The steps that we have to take are genuine, and I want to see real, tangible action. And I don't want to see participation trophies.
That's all for today, folks. We will be back next Wednesday with our newest episode. If you have not yet hit the subscribe button on YouTube, please do so. We are now trending towards 200 subscribers. So help us get to that number by hitting the subscribe button.